Good evening. Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. We have Yossi and Zack joining us in a second. For those who don't know me, my name is Amitai Freeman. I'm the founding director of the Z3 Project. Thank you for coming to the JCC this evening to hear this conversation with Zack Bodner, the president and CEO of the Oshman Family JCC, and Yossi Klein Halevi. Yossi, if you don't, you all know him because you're here for him. But he wrote several books. I just learned this right before this. Their podcast is the #1 most listened to podcast in the Jewish world. It's quite remarkable. And if you're not tuned into that podcast, you should. But it's a great, treat and pleasure to have them here. So, really, without further ado, because you're not here for me, you're here for them. Please welcome Yossi and Zack for this conversation.
I feel so blessed whenever I get to spend any time with Yossi. I contact him whenever I go to Israel, and he always makes time for me, if he's in town. Sometimes he's on a book tour, he's running around and blessing the world, but this is where he gets to come to our house. So thank you for being here, Yossi.
Well, Zack, it's such a pleasure, and we've been having these conversations for 30 years, and now we've decided to take it on Broadway. So I'm really really delighted to be with all of you.
And for those of you who listen to his podcast regularly with Danielle, I am a very weak substitute for Danielle, but I'll be playing him on TV tonight, so I'll be trying to play the role. But we're going to engage. We're going to have a conversation. It's going to span from everything from the situation right now, post-October 7th, the war, Israeli current politics, Jewish peoplehood, diaspora-Israel relations. We're going to talk for about 40 minutes, open it up to conversation and questions for about 20 minutes, and then you'll feel like you got just a little teeny taste of what there is in the world. But let's start with the current moment, Yossi. In this post-October 7th moment, there's a lot of angst. The Jewish people are struggling. We're trying to figure out who we are, our identity, Israeli society. You've called us potentially the post-Holocaust moment. Talk to us. Where are we in this moment?
The end of the post-Holocaust era.
End of the post-Holocaust, yeah.
And the post-Holocaust era was, in retrospect, a golden era. And I say in retrospect because when it turns out that when you're actually living through a golden era, you're not necessarily aware of it. You're aware of it when it ends. And I don't think we should romanticize the post-Holocaust era too much, because those who are of my generation, which is to say born shortly after the Shoah, will remember constant struggle. A quarter of the Jewish people was behind the Iron Curtain. Israel was fighting one existential war after another. American Jewry was still not fully accepted. I'm talking about the 1950s, 60s. But if you look at the trajectory of the post-Holocaust era, it was constantly upward and optimistic. And the Jewish people felt that the worst was behind us. And there are a few measures of that. One is in Israel, in 1967, the state of Israel that won the greatest military victory in Jewish history was 2.5 million people. Today it's 10 million. That's one story. Another story is the pattern of the wars. In 1948, we fought 7 Arab armies. 1967, 3. 1973, the Yom Kippur War, 2. 1982, the First Lebanon War, 1. And every war since then were these asymmetrical mini-wars in which Israel fought only one adversary. October 7th brought us full circle back to seven front war, fighting 7 armies, terror enclaves. And so there are different ways of measuring what we've lost but I think that in some ways, and this is something I think every Jew everywhere feels, is that what we've lost is the solid ground beneath us. And in Israel, the story of the unfolding of the wars that I've just laid out really is also the story of Israel gradually feeling itself permanent. the last existential war we fought was Yom Kippur.
Mhm.
But October 7th felt existential again. And American Jewry also had a trajectory of gradual empowerment. And it was expressed in what you and I were talking about before, of the gradual end of the conditional acceptance of Jews in America. Jews were always safe in America, more or less. Were always reasonably part of the society, but the acceptance was never fully unconditional. And in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, Jews started to feel unconditional acceptance.
Explain what you mean by conditionality. I mean, I know what you mean. My father's name who was born as a baby boomer, was born and named Paul, not Saul. There was something about what you had to do to be an accepted Jew.
You couldn't be too Jewish in the public space. You shouldn't speak with your hands. You shouldn't sound like you come from Brooklyn. And so there was a Jews were, I remember when Kennedy was assassinated, and my parents said, thank God it wasn't a Jew. And then a few days later, a Jew kills the assassin. And my parents went into a panic. Why do Jews always have to mix into everything? and there was this anxiety. And we're back. We're back there. And so...
But the conditionality's changed now.
The conditionality has come through the progressive anti-Zionists. And what they say to Jews today is, we are not anti-Semitic. We have no problem with Jews. You can come to our tent camps and have a Seder. But you have to renounce that one problematic part of your Jewishness. And that's the return of conditionality. And when you do that, what the message that you're conveying, especially to young Jews, is that there's something wrong with being Jewish. And it creates this sense of psychological unease. It creates a complex, an inferiority complex. And Jews, when I was growing up, the grown-ups would lower their voices when they were in public and if they said the word Jew. And I used to call it the American Jewish whisper.
Right.
And the American Jewish whisper gradually disappeared through the decades. And that was also part of the success story of the post-Holocaust era. So you had these two extraordinary success stories that were also reinforcing each other. Think of the two flags on the bima.
Right.
And it was that alliance, that entwinement of American Jewry and Israel that really created the post-Holocaust success story, the golden era. And now we don't know where we are, because what has been, to some extent, upended.
And now the whisper is not Jew so much as Israel or Zionism.
Yeah.
Share the story about when you were in the taxi or the Uber on the way back from the San Francisco airport last time you came into town. I remember you sharing the story with me where
You may have to share this story because I don't remember.
I mean, it's one of these things where when you're in an Uber, you have to figure out when the guy's, where'd you fly in from? Are you going to say Australia or are you going to say Israel?
Right.
Because do you want to get into the conversation about what it means?
Well, I'll tell you another Uber story. I was in Vancouver last week. I spoke at a synagogue, and people there afterwards said, how are you getting home? I said, I'll call an Uber. They said, not from here. I had to go around the corner just to calm the anxiety of people who were really worried. And so I had a driver, Ali, who turned out to be Iranian. So I asked him first where he's from. And when he said Iran, I said, I'm from Israel. He was so happy.
Go figure.
Now that's the other side of this moment. And I think it's really important because we're not friendless. Our friends are changing, or the perception that we had of who our friends were changing. And I remember in 1989, 1990, when communism started to fall in Eastern Europe. And I spent that year as a journalist reporting on the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, going from one falling domino to the next. It was an extraordinary experience. But I'm mentioning that because it was becoming clear already then that Western Europe, which was the, quote, good Europe for let's say, Jews in the 50s and 60s, was becoming the bad Europe. And Eastern Europe, at least in terms of its attitude toward Israel, was becoming the good Europe. And I don't know if that's still the case. I think we've lost a lot of ground, Israel has, in Eastern Europe in the last couple of years. But if you look around the world and you see where our alliances are strong, where the friendship for Israel is strong, India just happens to be the world's largest and most populous country. Africa, I have friends who do work in Africa, Israelis who work there, and they say that Israel is beloved. And the strange thing is, I mean, just Iran.
Right.
If and when, God willing, the regime falls, and it will fall, I'm convinced it will fall, Iran is going to emerge as one of Israel's closest allies. And so it's such a strange kind of moment where Israelis can feel, Jews can feel comfortable in parts of the Arab world, certainly in the Emirates still. Maybe if the Saudis join the Abraham Accords, something might open there. I was in Morocco before October 7th. I don't know what the situation there is like, but I felt far more comfortable wearing a kippah all over Morocco than I do anywhere in the West.
Wow.
So it's, and I think it's important that even when we speak about the end of the golden era, we haven't gone back to the 1930s. And I hear too much of that.
Right.
And it's really important for our mental health as a people not to use that as a frame of reference. And I could say just one last thing about that, which is I'm very uneasy about the ways in which we use the Shoah as a frame of reference for October 7th. When we talk about the largest number of Jews killed since the Holocaust. Now, technically, that's true. But for me, the real framing for October 7th is 100 years of conflict. It was the largest number of Jews, and not just Jews, because we know there were 20 or 25 Arab Israelis who were also killed, and a small number of Thai agricultural workers. But the largest number of Jews, Israelis killed in the history of this conflict. And the reason that I think it's so important for us not to use the Holocaust as a framing is because we're not back there. Now, on October 7th, we had a temporary lapse into victimhood that lasted all of one day. On October 8th, Israeli society, Jewish Israeli society, almost wall to wall, agreed that we can't allow the disastrous perception of the lapse back into victimhood to remain. And we undid it. We undid it at a terrible price. I believe the war was necessary. It was unavoidable. But you can't look at the ruins of Gaza and feel yourself to be a victim. I don't believe we're victimizers. I believe we had, again, we did what any country would do in our place, but we're not victims either. And it's really important for us to own our reclamation of power, because that was the greatest success of the post-Holocaust era, and we didn't lose that. If anything, we're more powerful today, I think, than we were before October 7th.
And yet you have said there is a war against the Jewish reclamation of power. Let's dive a little bit deeper into this issue of victimhood and vulnerability, because I think this is also where the Israeli Jewish mindset can clash with the liberal American Jewish mindset. The liberal American Jewish mindset wants to put us in the same boat with those who are a minority. We've been victimized before in the binaries of oppressed oppressor, colonized colonizer, in order to get in the good graces.
Yeah.
In America, with, when you're thinking about ethnic studies curriculum or whatever it is, we're often trying to say, no, we too are victims And that goes against everything that Israel and Israelis stand for.
Yeah, I think you're right. The heart of the Israeli ethos is, I mean, the way that Israelis put it is, we'd rather be hated than pitied, to which one can add, be careful what you ask for. But you know, it's I think that some of the reaction in parts of the American Jewish left after October 7th, and this is going to sound terrible, but I don't know a way to say this in a softer way. There was almost a sense of relief that we're victims again. And part of the anger that I sense against Israel, the renewed anger, and parts of the American Jewish left, is you blew it again. You know, why did you have to do Gaza? We were the victims on October. Why did you have to do October 8th? And that really is antithetical to the Israeli understanding of for us, there's nothing noble about being a victim.
Right.
That's not, there's, especially if you have the ability to reclaim power. And I think that that's very much a Jewish understanding of power. Judaism does not glorify power, and there are, I've just critiqued the left, there are parts of the Jewish right that glorify power. And that, to me, is as un-Jewish as repudiating power.
Right.
Judaism is about balance in all things. It's really the path of balance, of moderation,
Right.
of nothing in principle is forbidden, but there are restrictions on everything. And that's a very interesting dance. It's a way of engaging with the world, of engaging with material reality, but not indulging in it. And so that and what's true for our relationship to the material, to wealth, to sex, to whatever it is true for power. And that's something that, and it's understandable why the Jewish people is out of balance in our relationship to power. We went from the Shoah to one war after another, from the Shoah to another form of a war of survival, without pause. We went from 1945 to 1948. And then since 1948, war every 5 years or 6 years. And so, of course, we're out of balance. And it would have taken us many, many years to become comfortable with power, even under the best of circumstances. But fighting an existential war, an endless existential war, as we're trying to figure out our relationship to power, it's understandable why the left, parts of the left are uncomfortable with power, and parts of the right indulge in power.
Right.
But that's what Judaism is trying to tell us really is balance.
We talk about this at Z3 as internalizing our sovereignty, finally, which we're struggling with.
It's a great phrase. You should use that.
Thank you. We're using it. But recognizing that just because we've had our own state for now 78 years doesn't mean we've gotten it right. Your quote is, for the first time in 2,000 years, we have the power to defend ourselves, and we're still trying to learn how to use that power morally. Mm-hmm. That's what you've said. And it's this balance, like you talk about. We talk about the best of Israeli chutzpah, the best of diaspora sechel, to find that right balance.
Yeah.
How do you think we get there, Yossi?
I think that first of all, we have to have some rachmanis. Do I need to translate that word?
Compassion.
Some compassion on ourselves.
Yeah.
And accept the fact that really any people in our place would be hard-pressed to do better than we did. And I think that on the whole, we have not done badly. I don't want to give ourselves a grade, but we're in the struggle, and the fact that the Jewish people is still struggling with these issues is really important. And there are no easy answers, and we're going to make mistakes. And you know, I am worried about a kind of coarsening of Israeli discourse. So, for example, during the Gaza war, uh, you would hear the terrible phrase a lot. You would hear it on TV. You would hear it from journalists that there are no innocents in Gaza. Now, the Jewish people can't say that. We can't sound like jihadists. And that was a very common, it wasn't across the board by any means, but it was a very common phrase among many Israelis. And of course, among American Jews, I mean, I was stunned to see that 30 or even 40% of American Jews, according to one poll, believe that Israel committed genocide in Gaza. So on the one hand, there are no innocents in Gaza. On the other hand, there's no Hamas in Gaza. And I really felt that, going back and forth as I have these since October 7th, between these two realities, these two Jewish realities, it's often really been a very profound dislocation, a psychological dislocation, because what seems so clear there isn't clear at all here, and I understand why. Nevertheless, that gap, and it's a growing gap, really worries me.
Yeah, it worries us all. And that gap seems to be widening and widening, especially around the politics and the religiosity. Right? Those have always been trigger points for us. But let's talk about what the politics is going to look like in 6 to 9 months. Let's talk about how things will change if the election changes this government out or not. What do you think?
Look, if you look at every poll, except for the polls taken by Netanyahu's TV station, Channel 14, which has him winning by a landslide. Really, really, and that's very dangerous because he's going to lose. I believe he's going to lose, and and when, God willing, he does lose, many of his voters are going to say, you stole the election, because our polls showed overwhelming, a landslide. And so they're laying the groundwork already now, because they know which polls are real. Netanyahu knows very well what the poll numbers are, but he's laying the groundwork for the accusation of a stolen election. Now, I know that's inconceivable for Americans. You live in a democracy, and but we live in a very difficult situation, and so there is the numbers, the real numbers, show that there is no way that Netanyahu can put a government together. The only question is whether the opposition will be able to cross the 61 out of 120 seats. And you need a minimum of 61. Now, again, according to all the polls, there's a strong majority, but it includes the Arab parties. And after October 7th, and I understand this, even though I believe very strongly in integrating the Arab minority into the mainstream, I understand post-October 7th, a Bennett government that would once again depend on the Arab party Ra'am of Mansour Abbas would not have legitimacy. And so Bennett can't do it. So will there be 61 for what Bennett is calling a Zionist coalition? He's calling it now a liberal Zionist coalition. He's now owning the term liberal, which is very interesting given where Bennett comes from. Bennett is actually far more right-wing than Netanyahu. He's genuinely right-wing. Netanyahu used to be a pragmatist, and now he's an opportunist. And that's the dark side of pragmatism. And he really has become an opportunist, which in the past I would argue he was a genuine pragmatist. He was genuinely right of center, and now it's just whatever, there are no principles anymore. So I think that I don't believe there is any scenario that puts him back into power. And look what's happening. We have a fantastically successful campaign against Iran. It's true, it's not decisive, but it looks very different from Israel than it looks from here. From Israel, the war had 91% support in the first poll that I saw. We're all sitting in shelters, and Israeli Jews overwhelmingly supported and still support the war. And yet, he can't turn that into an electoral victory. The numbers have not moved. And it's an open question of whether this alliance, this merger between Bennett and Lapid, is going to lead to a strengthening of the bloc. I think it depends on whether Eisenkot joins them. And then if he does, then you really will have the perception of a winning ticket. So I hope that it does happen. But I'm very hopeful for these elections, and I can't allow myself to think what might happen if this coalition returns to power.
Here's what's interesting. I find it very, it's like almost a weird cognitive dissonance that Israelis who are overwhelmingly not a fan of Bibi are often big fans of Trump. You know, if you had a say in what was going on in our elections, it would and during the judicial reform process, Yossi, you co-wrote a letter calling on American Jews to make their voices heard in Israel. Do you still believe in that call to action? Do you still believe American Jews should have that sort of vociferous say? And in what way should
Absolutely.
they be?
I mean, look, it's the question is how does one join the fray? And my friend David Suissa, some of you I'm sure know him or know of him, the publisher of the Jewish Journal, David's comment about Jewish critics of Israel who say, they say we're offering tough love, and David says, I feel the tough.
Where's the love?
Where's the love?
Right.
To which Daniel Hartman responds, I'm not the love policeman. So I hear both arguments, and I lean closer to David on this one. But I feel that we're in a new era of Israeli-American Jewish relations. And we are either going to deepen the relationship or it's going to start drifting away. It's going to start disintegrating. And if we don't figure out ways of making it deeper, then the crisis really is. Right now, the crisis is still an opportunity. And one of the ways that I believe it needs to deepen is we have to start speaking honestly to each other. We need frameworks so that American Jews who feel understandably frustrated, outraged about much of what's happening in Israel. For example, the ongoing scandal, the atrocity of hundreds of terrorists, yes, settler extremists, looting, burning, slaughtering sheep, occasionally murdering. But the real scandal is that the Israeli government is allowing it to happen. And the even deeper scandal is that those who are entrusted with monitoring Jewish extremism, and I'm thinking specifically of the police and the Shabak, the Shin Bet, are both headed today by people who sympathize with the extremists. In Ben Gvir's case, it's not a question of sympathy. He is one of them. Ben Gvir is Zini is the head of the Shin Bet now. Ben Gvir is who Zini was supposed to be spying on. And literally so. The Shin Bet has a Jewish department that was spying on Ben Gvir and his friends. Now Ben Gvir is in charge of the police, and Zini, who sympathizes with the extremists, and I heard just the other day that his son is part of them. And so no one is monitoring the extremists. That's the real scandal. The scandal isn't that there are a few hundred extremists. It's the corrupt corruption goes much deeper.
So let's talk about how we talk about this.
Yes, but but just to finish
Yeah.
about your point about the diaspora.
Yeah.
This is exactly an issue that diaspora Jews should be speaking very strongly about. Your organizations should be making it clear publicly, not just speaking to the prime minister, but this is a question of the whatever is left of the moral credibility of the Jewish people at this point.
Okay, so then the question becomes, how do we have those conversations without adding fuel to the fire of the real Jew hatred that's out
Right.
there? How do we do this in a way where we're offering the tough and the love?
Right.
Because it can be easily taken out of context. It can be easily sound bitten to be added to, well, see, even the Jews are saying this about the Jewish state. How do we have this conversation that's taking it beyond mishpacha, that's not airing our dirty laundry? It's a constructive way. Our friend Jonathan Kessler talks about let's better, not batter. How do we do this in a way?
So look, we're all struggling with that question, and anyone who's in a position, a public position in Jewish life, has to struggle with that question. And in the latter months of the Gaza war, I was becoming increasingly uneasy about certain aspects of the war. The question of the food distribution and the hundreds of Palestinians who were killed, desperate people trying to get food, and there were clearly things that were going wrong, and I was struggling with how do I write about this, and it took me months. I worked on a piece. I published in the Times of Israel before Yom Kippur, and what I ended up doing in that piece was spending devoting half the piece to how difficult it is to write this piece and why, and laying out what we know about the lies that are being said about us. What we know, there is no starvation. That was a lie. There was no genocide, and on, and how difficult it is to morally critique yourself when you're surrounded by a lynch mob. And how I understand Israelis who just have shut down, because for most of the war, I shut down as well. But I felt that our moral credibility as a people depended on our at least raising certain questions. But I felt I could do that only by first pushing back against the lynch mob. And then within that context, making the argument that we have to critique ourselves. And I referred to the Sabra and Shatila massacre in 1982, the first Lebanon war, which Israel was accused of participating in. We didn't. And yet, we took indirect responsibility for it because we were there. And and the Kahan Commission, which was set up by the Israeli government, we used to actually have Israeli governments who would investigate themselves, and that was one of the finest moments in Israeli history, and it was the Begin government. They weren't happy. Begin didn't want to do it, but his own cabinet forced him to do it, a right-wing cabinet, and so. That, for me, is a precedent. And if we, how do you critique with love? You critique with it's not only love. I think we also need to critique with anger at the lynch mob. And once it's as if, Zach, I feel like we need to speak about Israel. We need to learn to speak about Israel in two ways, almost developing two languages. The first language is unconditional pushback against those who are trying to criminalize us. And to them we owe no moral reckoning. The second language is an internal Jewish language. Now, it's true that there's no such thing anymore really as an internal Jewish conversation. Everything today is transparent. You have an internal conversation, it's in the front page of the Times. But we have to at least maintain the fiction of an internal Jewish conversation to allow ourselves to really speak honestly about the issues we're facing. And I don't know how to do it, but I know that we have to do it.
We have to do it. I think a lot of it has to do with not so much the content of the message, but the tonality.
Right.
And the trust that's developed between partners, right? There's this notion of machlochet l'shem shamayim, like when you're having a disagreement for the sake of heaven, as opposed to just trying to score points. I think that's a big deal. And I think that right now there's a lot of fear in our willingness to be able to get vulnerable, especially when we're seeing our own children
Right.
and our own grandchildren in our own Jewish families become anti-Israel. It scares us.
No, totally understandable. But I wonder if the American Jewish community would have more credibility with the next generation if it had a strong voice, for example, on issues that are not controversial, like settler violence, on issues that for me should not have been controversial, like affirming Israeli democracy. Israel was always a Jewish and democratic state. And if we, God forbid, lose the democracy piece of it, we will lose much or most of the diaspora, or at least American Jewry. And so there's also a strategic issue here. It isn't only our defending our moral credibility, which I think is compelling enough of a reason, but there is a strategic component here, which is that in maintaining a morally credible position, we stand a chance of holding on to the next generation and of holding on to our non-Jewish friends, which I think is really should be the issue
It's vital. This idea of allyship is incredibly important. You've shared about what you think American Jewry needs to be offering Israel at this time, a heartfelt critique, a hug, a tough love. What do you think American Jewry needs from Israel at this time?
Tough love and a hard critique. And so I'll give you an example. On our podcast, for heaven's sake, we did an episode a little while ago about Mamdani, and I said there that I no longer feel that I can trust Jews who voted for Mamdani as part of the same project of defending the well-being of the Jewish people. I feel that something very basic has been violated, has been broken. And the pushback from listeners was more than all the other episodes combined. How dare you impugn my Jewishness? Which, of course, I was not making a halachic judgment of Mamdani voters. I was simply saying that if, after the last 2 years of your own community being delegitimized by Mamdani and his friends, of you being made to feel like you're outcasts in this country, and then you go and you hand the keys to the most Jewish city in the world outside of Israel, to that camp, I don't feel that I can trust you as a partner in the defense of the Jewish people anymore. That seemed to me a very straightforward critique. But the same people who feel empowered to relentlessly criticize Israel suddenly reveal very thin skin when the criticism is reciprocated. And I made the point on the podcast that I welcome your criticism of Israel because you're engaged with Israel. You're not walking away. You have the right to criticize Israel. You have the responsibility to criticize Israel. If we take Zionism seriously, and that Israel is the center of the Jewish people and the center of the Jewish world, then of course what happens in Israel, the nature of Israeli democracy, the nature of Israeli society. It has to be of concern to the diaspora. And since October 7th, we know that what happens in Israel directly impacts on the diaspora's physical well-being. So how can we not listen to your critique? But it's reciprocal. I also have the right to criticize American Jews when I feel something is going very wrong here. And there are things that are going very wrong in both of our communities.
I've always appreciated, this is why I call you my own guru, spiritual and intellectual guru. I've always appreciated your self-awareness, your ability to be reflective in that way. You said in the beginning of your book, Letters to My Palestinian Neighbor, I'm not going to negate your narrative. I'm just asking you not to negate mine either. I'm sharing my narrative. A lot of your work has been in interfaith relations, in working with Muslims at Shalom Hartman. How has that work continued post-October 7th? How are you?
How's that working out for me?
How's that working out for you, Yossi?
Not well. And, we ran a program at Hartman called the Muslim Leadership Initiative, which was extraordinary and an extraordinary success until it wasn't. And we brought something like 170 young emerging Muslim American leaders to Jerusalem, to a Zionist institution, to study Israel, Judaism, Zionism, the conflict. And we did this for almost a decade. And then October 7th happened, and it collapsed. The bottom fell out. And the program doesn't exist anymore. We ended the program basically on October 8th. And we haven't done a full post-mortem yet, and that's really, there's a lot that needs to be unpacked, because what that program on the one hand proved was that it's possible. We didn't do dialogue. We did Jewish and Zionist education. And we weren't trying to make them into Zionists, and we did not. But we were trying to get them to understand. And we thought we had succeeded, and that's an open question. And what has happened since October 7th is that Muslim communities in this country, not just radical Islamists, mainstream Muslim communities, have effectively declared war on the Jewish community. And what we were trying to prevent with this program, and I had a partner, a Muslim partner, in the Hartman program, Imam Abdullah Antepli, who was at Duke University at the time, and he actually, Imam Abdullah, initiated the program and came to Hartman and asked if we would sponsor it. And Abdullah's vision, or his fear, was that the European model of Muslim-Jewish relations was going to be imported to America. And he said, we have to try to prevent that from happening. And so this program was an experiment that failed, but it was a noble attempt to try to prevent what actually has happened, which is the Europeanization of Muslim-Jewish relations in America. That's where we are now. So we're in a very strange situation now, because the logic that animated this program was that America is different, and Jews and Muslims have neighborly relations, and which was true, and maybe it still is to some extent, I don't know. But things can happen in America that can't happen anywhere else. And so let's try to really create a model of Muslim-Jewish relations here that can then filter, elsewhere. And I think that the opposite is going to happen. I think that if there will be breakthroughs in Muslim-Jewish relations, it will happen, as I spoke about earlier, it'll happen in the Middle East, in parts of the Middle East. It's not going to happen here. And that for me is heartbreaking. I put in 10 years of work into that program. I don't regret it, but it did not succeed. And my feeling about Muslim-Jewish relations remains unchanged in that the 20th century was the era of breakthrough in Christian-Jewish relations. That was really the great turning point, the mid to late 20th century. The 21st century, I believe, needs to be a focus on Muslim-Jewish relations for very practical reasons. The security of Israel and the safety of the diaspora largely depend on changing the dynamic in the relationship with the Muslim world. Right now, that seems nearly impossible, and I'm currently not engaged in Muslim-Jewish work. I don't feel an opening, and I also, frankly, I'm too angry. I'm still too angry. So it's just not the moment, but I believe that it does have to remain on the agenda.
Again, I appreciate your honesty, your candor, your willingness to be self-reflective and hopeful at the same time. I agree with you. I think the Abraham Accords offer an opportunity. I remember when we would go, when I was at AIPAC, and we would meet with Palestinians, they often had a much more open outlook to coexistence, and they said they would come and speak on American university campuses, and that folks were much more extreme out here, even back then.
Right.
So I think a lot of the breakthroughs will probably come from your neighborhood, out of geostrategic political necessity,
Yeah.
the welcoming of Israelis coming for business and tourist reasons, right? Those kind of openings will happen. But you still remain hopeful. You're still a spiritual person. I want to talk for a moment about your spirituality, and then I'll open it up for some questions from the audience. I want to just ask about your spiritual journey, how your ups and downs have gone, your belief in God, what you think about God in these moments of October 7th, when you hear these stories of the hostages being held in these worst, horrible conditions and what was done with the sexual assault. How has your belief not been shaken? Or if it has, how have you come back to you?
Well, if you mentioned the hostages, one of the extraordinary things that happened to at least some of the hostages was this spiritual awakening. And they've come back with these extraordinary stories. And you really feel this infusion of spirituality coming from some of the hostages. And in some cases, it's explicitly Jewish. In other cases, it's more generic spirituality, but no less powerful. And so we're really, I think, seeing an unexpected infusion of spirituality into Israeli society from the most wounded part of it. But more broadly, Zach, this. I once asked Racheli Frankel, who was the mother of one of the three boys who were murdered by Hamas in 2013, 14. When was it? And it led to one of the mini wars with Hamas. And I asked her about her faith. She's a woman of very strong faith. And she said, you know what I told myself after my son was killed was, so now you suddenly realize that bad things happen in the world because it happened to you? Where have you been? And she said, I realized that I didn't have the right to suddenly stop believing because this happened to me. And the question of the Shoah, for example, I grew up in a survivor family and with a very complicated relationship to faith. My father grew up in a very strictly Orthodox family. After the war, he left religion completely, and then gradually became a believing Jew. And Israel had a lot to do with it. And so, what he used to say was, I don't understand anything, but all I know is that there's something very strange about this people. that doesn't make sense. It's not rational. And I think that, I've thought a lot about that over the years, and I think that my understanding of what he was trying to say is that the story of the Jews, we talk about this is the moment when one is supposed to affirm Netzach Yisrael, Lo Yishaker, and go through all of the cliches. And cliches are cliches because they happen to be true, but there's something else there. It's not only the survival of the Jewish people; it's also the persistence, the survival of anti-Semitism, which is so strange. It's the survival of the Jews and the survival of hatred of the Jews, which has gone for thousands of years. And what's this story all about? And I think that I always believed in God. I always had my struggles with parts of Judaism, and that continues to today. But I don't think I ever didn't believe in God. And I think the reason for that, and this will sound very strange, and I will try to explain it, but was the Holocaust. My faith in God was grounded in the Holocaust. And for a few reasons. One is I grew up in a neighborhood of mostly religious survivors, Borough Park, those of you who've heard of it. And I grew up with stories of Jews, my parents' friends, Jews in the camps, who tried to keep something of observance. And that's very powerful to have known those people. But I think there's also something about the strangeness of the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a surreal event. It's an irrational event. And I've read lots of historians who try to explain why this happened. And you go along and you read and you say, oh, okay, I understand that. There was this economic situation, this sociological development. But you come to a point where it stops making sense. And so growing up in a survivor family and growing up immersed in the Shoah, I always had this sense of the world as being a totally absurdist place. And that, that sense of not believing that this world is what society says it is. It's a very strange place we live in. We don't know where we were before we were born. We don't know where we're going after. And we're condensed into this brief period. And we go through our daily lives and our professions. And then we're gone. It's a really strange place. and so I had that awareness from when I was, as long as I remember myself. And when you're aware of the absurdity of life itself, you can go in one of two directions. You can become a nihilist, or you can go on a spiritual journey. And I went through both, but it's the same ground of nihilism and spirituality. They're both grounded in an acute awareness of the absurdity of this world and this life. So I don't know if it's hard for me to give a more coherent answer than that, but I always had that sense that there's something else. That the unseen has to in some way make more sense than what we see. And that did come from the Holocaust. That was the original impetus. And so I was drawn very strongly to mysticism, to the mystical traditions in all the great faiths. And that's still very much my religious life today. It's an engagement as a religious Jew with Jewish mysticism and mysticism generally.
I love that. I'm going to take that to the bank, that the unseen can be maybe less absurd than what we're dealing with in the seen world.
Or ultimately more real, which is what every religion says, that the unseen is more real than the material.
I love that. Okay, Maya's coming with a microphone. if you have a question, raise your hand. She'll try and find you in the audience. Please try to keep it to a real question. I know that's always hard with our people. They don't have any opinions, so we'll take it for a few minutes. We'll take some questions, and then I'll wrap up with one last question to get us on the right note. Sabrina has her hand up over here.
Good evening. Thank you so much. It's
Hi,
really
Sabrina.
a fascinating conversation. Hi. So I wanted to pull on the thread that you started about peoplehood and specifically about American Jewry. I'm wondering if you can help us, if there's some context in the history of the Jews, the long history of the Jews, of our fractures and metamorphoses, if there's some way that we can contextualize the fracture that's happening in the American Jewish community around Israel and this issue.
It's a great question. I mean, look, the fracture is happening in Israel as well. To some extent, different fault lines, but there is, I think that in some way, most of the divisions in the Jewish people, whether it's political, religious, secular, cultural, can be mapped out along the particularist universalist divide, and I feel very, very strongly that that's the divide we need to be working on, because one part of the Jewish people is moving more and more in an enclosed particularist, that's the Orthodox or the right, and another part is moving in such an open-ended way that they're losing any connection with their Jewish grounding. And that's the danger, is that we're becoming two peoples. And in terms of the context, I mean, look, the context that's always used is the Second Temple period. And that's I find that useful in an Israeli context to a point. And the tradition, but I actually don't accept the traditional reading of why we lost sovereignty in the Second Temple period. And the traditional reading is that it was because of hatred among Jews. I think that was the consequence. I think the cause was corruption and fanaticism, zealotry. And that's really, if you just read the history of the Second Temple period, that's literally what happened. The monarchy became increasingly corrupt, and parts of the people of Israel became more and more politically extreme and led us into a suicidal war against Rome. And what's happening in Israel with this government is that it is the meeting point between corruption and zealotry. And that's the danger. That's the danger. So I've been more focused on trying to understand the historical context for the Israeli schism. In terms of the American Jewish schism, I have to really think about that, but it's a great question. I have to leave it open-ended.
Thank you. Next question for Yossi. I thought I saw somebody in the back with their hand up. Over here, Maya. Oh,
Somebody here?
Oh, hi. How are you? Sorry,
Hi,
didn't see you. Grace.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. This question may sound a little specific, but it's got a long tail, and it has to do with an article by Leah Leibovitz last week in Tablet about carrying firearms. And on my recent trips to Israel, it's quite common to see people who are not in IDF uniforms obviously carrying sidearms. Leal's point, I think, was that a lot of synagogue and JCC budgets are increasingly being spent on security, and he was sort of making the point of maybe Jews should start taking more personal responsibility for security by carrying firearms. So from the standpoint of Israel, an Israeli perspective, coming back to Americans, whether that's a good idea, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
That's an easy one for an Israeli. The answer, of course. I think the fact that you have armed guards in front of the synagogue is a start. I don't think it's enough. I think there should be some people inside the synagogue who are armed as well, but I generally hesitate to comment about internal American Jewish affairs, but I can't help myself with this one. So,
I will tell you, having just spent spring break part of the time in London and part of the time in South Africa and gone to a synagogue in both places, the armed guards outside of both of those were volunteers. The communities outside of America, and maybe outside of North America, I'm not so sure about Canada, are often volunteer driven. It's a different culture in America, but I think it's a very tricky question because of the politics. Everything is political these days, but I think that that's, from my perspective, what becomes tricky.
no, look, it's and obviously there's a tremendous psychological block, and understandably so, for many liberal American Jews in terms of gun control, and it would require a very deep change in the Jewish community.
Thank you for the question. All right, Maya, now back to you.
So I have two comments, or two questions actually.
I don't. There.
Right here. One is there are beliefs that if the Hezbollah-Israel military war finishes before the elections, then that Netanyahu will continue to win the election. And I'd like to hear your opinion about that. And the second one is, what do you believe will happen with the Haredim and enrollment in the military?
So a well-known Jewish columnist who I will not mention wrote recently that he's worried that if there'll be a victory over Iran and its proxies, it will be good for Netanyahu. I'm not worried about that. Let's have the victory, and then we'll deal with the election. And the fact that this is Israel's longest war. It is now longer than the 1948 war, and even if we win, I think that there's still not going to be a majority that wants Netanyahu, that wants another 20 years of Netanyahu. You know, I think 20 years has been enough. And in 1945, Winston Churchill, who really did win World War II, was thrown out of office by a profoundly ungrateful British electorate. And, Netanyahu likes to compare himself to Churchill. So, bivakasha. And
in the Haredi serving in the
people who I respect in the Haredi community, who know the Haredi community and its complexity, and it's very there is no such thing as a homogeneous Haredi community, say that about 30% of Israeli Haredim want to be part of the mainstream. And about 30%, to one extent or another, would accept some form of military service and want to be part of the workforce. There's a small movement they call themselves Haredim Yisraelim, Israeli Haredim. And I think that they're potentially much larger than they are at present. There's a lot of unrest below the surface in the Haredi world that we don't see among young people. And the problem in the Haredi world is, first of all, us, the non-Haredi majority, because we are the great enablers of Haredi separatism. We pay for it. And as soon as the money stops, you will have a major crisis in the Haredi community. So that's the first stage is stop the money. Before we even try, I have to remember the applause lines for my next appearance.
Remember where you are in Northern California.
That's
also,
right.
You know.
That's right. So and that's what this next election, Bennett is making this next election about that. He's making the Haredim the keystone of his campaign, which is very smart, because the Haredim are the great unifiers of Israeli society. Everyone is against them. And so the only chance we have of, in a way, of reconstituting a Zionist democratic majority in Israel is by really identifying who doesn't belong. And the Haredim don't belong. But potentially many of them will be part of it. But in order to get them to be part of it, they have to be excluded from the government. Because if they're in the government, the money keeps flowing. So that's what it depends on. So I'm really not looking, at least at the initial stage, at the question of the draft. The first stage is really what Bennett is emphasizing, which is shifting the budget priorities from the community that doesn't serve to those who do serve. And the scandal, I'm not running for office. The scandal of this government, I mean, there are so many scandals, but the Haredi scandal is that greater resources are being diverted to yeshiva students than to reservists. And that is the one indication of a country that's committing suicide. Because eventually many of the reservists will leave. If this continues another 4 years, many will leave. And so this election, again, is really about, it's about the future of Israel in the most elemental way. You know, every election, we always say, this is really the most fateful election in Israel's history. But this one really, really is.
All right, Grace, do we have one last one in the back? All right.
Thanks, Yossi, for being in the neighborhood. I was a little surprised that you said there was only 1 day of victimhood on 10/7 in the Israeli mentality, and by 10/8, ready to be confident again. I'm just wondering where you see the protracted hostage situation and the narrative and the continued efforts around, not only advocacy but bringing them home, let alone everyone who's killed and did not come home. How does that affect, you think, the victim story or not?
It's such a great point and a really necessary corrective to what I said, because the inability of Israelis and the Jewish people generally to start getting past October 7th was because the hostages were still in October 7th. And until they weren't extracted, we as a people were still stuck there. And so you're right, it wasn't until the last hostage came home, and not all of them came home. Netanyahu scandalously on Yom HaZikaron, on the most recent Memorial Day, delivered a shameless, even for him, a shameless election speech. We're saying, I brought the hostages home. So yes, you're right, and the hostages were, it's what and the thing about the hostages that really reinforces your argument is that it was the anti-Entebbe. We sent commandos halfway across Africa in 1976 to rescue 100 Israeli hostages. We couldn't save 1,200 Israelis on October 7th within the borders of a sovereign Jewish state, and then we couldn't rescue the hostages while we were in Gaza, within shouting distance of where they were being held. So, we had one Netanyahu brother who was the great rescuer, and another who was not. And so you're right. That was really the psychological consequences of the prolonged agony of the hostages was that we couldn't get past it. But we can now, or at least we can start trying to. And I think that's the challenge of this period.
Yossi, thank you for holding back how you really feel tonight. No, I'm grateful that you're always able to have this conversation with us. Grateful for the community being out here, being open-minded, being willing to listen. I want you to end with one final note for us. What's the call to action, the responsibility? What would you like to see American Jewry, this community do to take away from this talk tonight? Tell us where we should go now.
Well, you know, when I meet with American Jewish groups, people ask, well, what can we do? What should we do? And I'm always so reluctant. That goes back to the question of firearms and synagogues. I just find that it's the organized American Jewish community is so committed, and you have so many extraordinary people. And we've never had a community like this in Jewish history. We've never had a diaspora like this. And I've spent too much time in Israel. I grew up here, but it was a long time ago. And I don't know the culture anymore. And I'm very, very hesitant to give advice. But I will say I won't offer any practical advice because that's really up to you. But I would just say, in terms of a conceptual approach to this time, I think that we need to start nurturing multidimensional Jews, which means Jews who are able to hold conflicting truths or insights about Israel, about Judaism, about the contemporary Jewish reality, and we are in a situation where, if you look across the Jewish political and religious and cultural spectrum, you'll see significant insights scattered across the spectrum. So I'll just give you one example of my own personal political development as an Israeli. Was moving to Israel and starting to listen. This was in the early 1980s, and listening to Peace Now, and then listening to the settler movement. And both of those were really at their political heyday then. And I would listen to Peace Now, and they would say, we can't occupy another people. We can't permanently rule over them and still remain the Israel that we know. And I said, well, that makes a lot of sense. Then I would listen to the right, and they would say, yeah, but we can't make peace with a Palestinian national movement that rejects our legitimacy. And I'd say, well, that makes sense. And I realized that the place that I belonged in was the center, because the political center is that ground that brings together these insights. And that's just one example. And I think it's true of so many of our dilemmas. And what I hope we can come out of this period of turmoil by not being more strident, one-dimensional Jews. That's not going to get us anyplace good, whether you're on the left or the right, but and stay on the left and stay on the right, but have some place in your consciousness that isn't sure. And, we've turned our politics into surrogate religious faith, and politics is the art of this flawed reality. We're trying to make sense of it. Politics are not revelation. And so there should be some place in our Jewish makeup for the voice that isn't my camp. And I think that if we begin, and it begins in ourselves, it begins in our own consciousness, to start nurturing that sense of complexity, then I think we will really be a much healthier people.
On that note, nurturing more complexity, more nuance, the ability to listen, to be multidimensional, you are the leader of that movement. So thank you, Yossi, for being here and guiding us.
Thank you. Thank you all. Thanks for coming. Thanks for engaging. And Zach, thanks for your friendship and for your leadership.
Thank you. Thank you.